Hi there, it's Mr. Clark. Welcome to our unit on medieval music theory. We'll be starting out taking a look at pitch notation, and specifically this is lesson MED.1.1 on unheighted neumes. Through a lot of the medieval era, we don't have a lot of surviving music notation. A lot of music was passed on orally. It was taught by rote from generation to generation, and it survived that way. However, eventually people realized, hey, there's kind of a lot of music to memorize out there. So they started developing techniques to figure out how to help them remember it in some sort of written, permanent way. So the first method that we'll see here is known as unheighted neumes. The signs that they used to indicate pitch were known as neumes, spelled as you see here, which likely comes from the ancient Greek word pneuma, meaning breath, or pneuma, meaning nod. And the initial signs came from accents that were already present in various languages and are still present in some languages today. So they're kind of tiny here, but you have the acute accent that starts down left and goes up right, which indicates a rising sound. You have the grave and you have the circumflex. And all of these kind of indicate the sorts of pitch motion that you would expect. Starts low and goes high, starts high and goes low, starts low and goes high and back low. Which is obvious to us, but isn't necessarily obvious. And these accents have some assumptions baked into them that made their way into our modern music notation. For instance, we read from left to right in terms of time. So time starts over here and goes that way. That's not necessarily obvious. There are languages like Arabic that go the other direction, Hebrew as well, I believe. And then the other assumption that's baked in is that lower on the page means what we call lower in pitch. Higher on the page means higher in pitch. But our discussion of like high and low pitch, that direction is kind of arbitrary. So you have time going this way and sounds going higher going that way, which both translate to our modern system of notation. Depending on where the manuscripts are from, the neumes are going to look different. There wasn't a hugely standardized way of doing things, anything in general, across the medieval era, because there wasn't as nearly as much communication between communities as there is today. But particularly, these neumes were written by generally scribes in monasteries, which tended to be pretty closed off from the outside world. So we're going to look here at the neumes used at St. Gall, a monastery in modern-day Switzerland, since there's a lot of scholarship on these works, and a lot of these principles will apply to other manuscripts. The visual forms might just be slightly different, so you'll have to spend some time figuring out the correspondences. So the two most basic neumes are the virga and the punctum. So the virga indicates a note that's higher than the previous note. That makes sense because low to high, and a punctum is the opposite. It's a single note lower than the previous. Kind of an abbreviation of this sign. They were like, well, we already have that one, so we can just abbreviate that one. Less work. Bam. Done. Great. So if each syllable is a single note and you never have repeated notes, this is great. So you have, I'm trying to think of a good tune. Hot cross buns. So you can just call the first note hot, whatever. Cross goes down, buns go down, and then hot is higher, cross, buns, but then we get to 1 a penny, and there are repeated notes, so that's not super useful because this is just higher or lower. Okay, so we'll come back to that later. If each syllable is a single note, yep. So if you have syllables that are sung to multiple notes, then you need some additional signs. Usually, if you have multiple notes sung to a single syllable, there's a single neume that encompasses all of them. If it's like hot cross buns, then hot has two, cross has two, and then buns has one. Kind of hip tune. I dig that. Anyway, so you have the pace, which means you start on a low note and you go to a high note. The clevis, which means you start on a high note and go to a low note. You have the torculus, little turn. You start on a low note, go to a high note, and then on a low note. The porrectus, you start on a high note, you go to a low note, and end on a high note. The scandicus, start on a low note, go up, and then keep going up. And then a climacus, start high and go low, low. So these last two are pretty obvious how they derive from the Virga and the punctum. These ones, not as much. It's kind of you have a low and then a high, and then you kind of just connect them. You have a high and then a low, and you kind of just connect them. So low, high, low, and then you so it kind of fills in. There are various modifications for neumes. There are some special forms known as liquescent neumes, where the text must be connected in a fluid manner in terms of the words that you're actually saying. So it usually appears with specific letter combinations. We're not exactly sure how that affects the musical performance, but in terms of how they look, the end of the neume typically gets a little curlier. So pace normal, pace with the liquescent neume. So it doesn't change the actual pitch, just changes the manner of how you say that. Certain notes might be given more weight, because when you're speaking, some syllables are more important than others. So the neume might be more angled, the punctum might turn into a dash, which they call a tractulus, or by adding a small horizontal dash to the right part of the neume. This is known as an epicema. So here's a clivis with an epicema on the first note. Again, remember the clivis is high, then low, and they kind of connected it. So if you want the high note to be a little more weighty, you'd put that epicema up there. And if you want the low note, then you put the epicema down there. You might also see some letters that are abbreviations for standard performance indications. So if you see a C up in the neume area, that stands for celeriter, which means fast. T, tenere, means to hold, which we think maybe means make the last note longer. And then there are some, just useful indications like sursum, this note is higher than you think it's going to be, or usum, this note is lower than you think it's going to be. There are also some neumes that we don't really know how they were performed. We don't have enough scholarship on these because they didn't really survive into further notational systems. They also have fun names like oriscus, apostrophe, quilisma, trigon, and depending on sources that you look at, they'll have various different interpretations for what these mean, but going from one source to another doesn't seem very consistent. So this is how they looked like in practice. And if you go to the PDF textbook, this is in color as well, but you kind of see someone had written the text, and then someone later had gone back and written in these little neumes. So you can see some of these. Let me bring it closer. Will that help? Yeah. So you can see actually some of the shapes that we've talked about, where you have this clivis with the epicema on top. Lots of virgas. That looks like actually no. But yeah, you can see some of the shapes that we talked about. And it's also important to note that we still don't know what this sounds like from this notation. There's no way to translate this into actual modern pitches because it's all relative. This was used as a memory aid. If you already knew the tune, then you could look at this and be like, oh yeah, it goes higher here, and then it goes down. But if you don't know the original tune, you can't reconstruct it from this. So that's where we're at. The notation system is not yet useful for us to know what this music sounds like. So as we keep moving forward, we will find more and more specific pitch notation that will help us reconstruct medieval music. See you next time.